My name is Walead Beshty, and I'm an artist. I mean, I think a nascent curiosity for me was, why do things look the way they do? And why does how they look create a kind of structure for life or living, or a certain kind of experience of who you are as a human being in relationship to the appearance of things? I think in a way, a meandering set of questions found a kind of forum within an art context for me. With regard to art, it's how do things get to where they are? How is that implicit in our experience of a particular thing? When you see it in a museum, you don't see all the infrastructure behind it, both literal labor and international shipping and customs and crating and unpacking and all the work involved, this sort of network of almost multitudes of people that are at work to make this thing appear as though it just arrived out of nowhere. But thinking about all these different frames, and that the boundaries between things and their frames or their support structures and the thing itself is not actually so discrete. It's quite fluid, and they're interwoven. Things are made to be exhibited as much as a film is made to be projected and shown to an audience in a certain kind of context. So all of these different platforms of reception and production are actually far more integrated than was immediately apparent to me. And if there is a narrative to my work, on one level it's that. It's starting with micro circumstances and trying to build out and seeing how those structures unfold. It's not so much that a particular image looks a certain way and you go, why is there a shape there and a thing there? Those are kind of uninteresting questions, right? They're questions that are black boxes in the sense of my particular motivation. Like, what does the artist mean when they do X, Y, and Z? And like, what's the meaning of a triangle being here? And, and all of that to me felt both uninteresting and also self-aggrandizing, that some particular minute choice would have grand meaning and should be decoded. And more so, I was interested in how objects were integrated within those systems that generated them. And using chance operations compositionally was a way to emphasize the structures around the thing, and certainly structures that I control. Like, I would organize a set of parameters, and then what developed from those parameters was like outcomes of a game. But if you don't like the outcome of a game, you don't modify or alter the outcome, you change the conditions of the game. And that also gave, for me, a way to get outside of seeing things in isolation, but rather as windows into a larger world, into a larger set of circumstances that are in play, but generally speaking, get repressed. Simply by juxtaposing things and putting them to use in ways that are unsanctioned uses for them. So with the X-rays that I carry in my luggage, as simplistic as just simply exposing during travel photographic film to airport security, produces an outcome that wasn't planned, but is a kind of possibility. It's a sort of agency that we all have to produce outside of restriction, that these restrictions and these types of internalized control structures actually can be twisted to create moments of autonomy or freedom within those systems. They don't prescribe their usage. And I think in a bigger sense, that idea interested me just because of the way that art and critical and political understandings of aesthetics were usually limited to discussions of pure dominance, how everything is controlled, how there's no other option, outside of the surveillance state or the repressive state apparatus or the violent state apparatus or what have you, that there's actually agency that individuals can have even within restriction, and that even if it's as mundane as producing a seductive object out of these restrictions, it was another possibility to, say, misuse a kind of technology or find an option that wasn't restricted by those technologies. I prefer not to conceal how things are made, but there's no meaningful revelation in how they're made. Mm-hmm. in the sense that if someone wants to experience something as like a colorful object over their couch, that's fine. That's totally a viable relationship to a thing. So for me, it's not so much that process is important. I mean, it's important in the sense of what results from that process, but it's not important in the sense of the reception of the thing. I think that that's largely up to a viewer. And I don't mean that anything can mean anything, right? Like, I don't mean this total, like, everyone's experience is subjective. I think you put a set of circumstances out there and there's no barrier to engagement with an aesthetic object. But I just try not to conceal where it came from rather than unveil its making. What initially intrigued me about copper was the way that it was so reactive to its physical circumstance. And why it recurs is because I find it's also a metal that you can high polish so that it's reflective and mirror-like, so it casts an image of its surroundings as it absorbs the effects of those surroundings. So in a basic sense, it's a very particular type of material for me, and which is why it kind of comes back again and again. It was sort of how I was thinking about photographic objects, is that emulsion is just as highly reactive. It's reactive to light, contact, and chemical reaction. I've always been interested in those reactive types of material. In the case of the body prints, and that covers the prescription meds, there were physical imprints of my hand and also the MRIs. One of the elements that I was thinking about with those was to see myself as a component of the show. And in other words, and one of my components is the array of drugs that I take. That those would be charted, and those are also commercial and corporate influences, other evidences of economies of scale brought to bear. But there was also a kind of connection to the machines. In other words, the MRI, which takes slices, right, magnetic resonance imaging, takes slices or vivisects the body, kind of extended into the logic or built on the logic of the machines that were splayed out, and of machines being sort of anthropomorphized in our daily life. We think of them as having personalities. We also speak about ourselves as though we're machines. Like, I don't have the bandwidth for this. There's all these different ways that we formulate ourself in relationship to the objects that surround us, and then we also formulate those objects to reflect ourselves. Even though we think of these things having the sanctity of bodies, you know? Like, you shouldn't do something to a machine that you wouldn't do to yourself. You shouldn't drill a hole through it that hurts a machine, which machines can't be hurt. You know, they don't experience violence, suffering, pain. But that anthropomorphization of these objects interested me in kind of misusing them, but also, say, stretching out a contained object to being an upright figure and what that does to its operation, and that it's still animate or it's still functional or trying to perform its function while in that kind of state. Usually televisions or those types of objects are used as mere platforms for the traffic of images. The thing itself is not really considered as a flexible thing, right? It can show any type of image, but as an object, its use is strictly regulated. And it also acts as like a black box, you know, just as the upright machines do. You don't see inside them. So one base impulse there was to simply punch a hole in it to be able to look inside, but also to treat it as a thing in the world. It's just a thing. And it also is a thing that if you punch a hole through it, it can generate its own image on its surface. It creates another kind of picture simply by reacting to the forces applied to it. And that also allowed you to look at that object in and of itself and the logic of how it processes information or how it presents information or how it presents pictures, and to let that self-generate, you know, to put it into a position where it can work for itself or produce its own kind of picture according to the conventions that were built into it. the way that my work has always moved forward was that each project produces another set of questions or problems or openings that naturally extend into what happens after that. There's a certain logic that the practice creates that isn't really me. It's kind of like it sets up its own rules and sort of procedures and things like that that make sense. And because of that, each thing kind of cascades into another set of sort of circumstances. It naturally sort of expands or accrues or moves forward in time.